Hello, everyone. I want to talk a little bit about the first exam and some things you can do to prepare for it. Before getting into the exam, I wanted to remind you about the tutoring options. Attending tutoring, I think, will be a great thing to do to get ready for the exam, and you can get some extra credit for doing so. For every 2 hours of tutoring you have this semester, you can excuse one of the discussion board grades. I think participating in tutoring or participating in the discussion boards are both equally valid in terms of showing that you are engaged with the class and doing your best to learn. And ideally, you can sort of max out on that participation part of your grade. And if this is going to help you to do that, then I definitely encourage doing so. So let's go ahead and talk about the exam. And I want to talk about some logistics to start with. And first of all, some of the items that will be important as you take the exam. You will be provided with a periodic table. It's not something you need to memorize. You'll always have access to it. You just will need to know how to interpret it, and that could be done in a variety of ways based on the material that we've covered so far in the semester. You will need to bring a pencil and a calculator. Very, very important that you have a calculator. The exam is written assuming that you have access to that. You will not have time to do long division on the side of the paper. So make sure you have a calculator to help you with that. And one note on that, and I do mention this a bit later here, the calculator should not be your cell phone. Okay, it should be a separate calculator. So make sure you have one. There are some that you can check out from the library, so that is an option you will have. But in some way, make sure you're able to have a calculator. And also, I would say it should be one you're familiar with, right? So you don't want to show up to the exam with a calculator that you don't know how to use. So make sure you're spending some time ahead of time familiarizing yourself with whatever calculator you are going to use. You may have a note card on this test. We'll talk about that a little bit more on one of the later slides. And then in terms of your cell phone, obviously, if you have some emergency you need to be aware of, that's fine, but I shouldn't see the cell phone during the exam. It should be put away. It should not be used as a resource, as a calculator, as any kind of a reference. So if you have an emergency and you need to step outside to take a phone call, that is fine. However, it shouldn't be something that I see you using while you're taking the exam. Also related to the logistics, I want to talk a little bit about the timing involved for this exam. So we have basically about a 3-hour block of time for the lab. The first 90 minutes of that time will be set aside for completion of the exam. So the exam should be something that you can get done during a 90-minute period of time. So just kind of when you get the exam, be aware that that's how long you will have. And then once you're done with the exam, the rest of that class time will be for completing the separation of a mixtures lab that we had begun prior to this lab period. Couple of notes on that. It's possible some of you might get done in one day. Usually it does take 2 days for most people. So if you are someone that is completely done with that lab, you are free to go once you're done with the exam. And then the second thing is that we're not going to start on the lab activity while other people are taking the exam. Okay, so that would be kind of rude in terms of people trying to concentrate, and there's all this noise in the background of people working on something else. So if you get done early, feel free to take a break, go do whatever you need, and then come back, around basically the 90-minute mark to then go ahead and complete that lab. Okay, let's talk about this note card. You may have a note card on the first exam. It can be a 3-inch by 5-inch note card, so I have included the units there. You can write on both sides is fine. You can, if you want to print something out on a printer and then tape it on, that's fine. So if you want some reference on there, one of the things I would recommend is that anything you think you might need to know related to nomenclature be on there. So for example, if you don't have all of the polyatomic ions memorized yet, that would be something to maybe put on your note card. But anything on one note card is fine. You will not necessarily have this option for later exams. So part of this is on the first exam. There's a lot of information right away. Some of it is sort of memorization, and I don't want that to be the focus of your preparation. I want to make sure you are preparing by making sure you can apply the concepts. So if you feel like you need to memorize something, I would rather you write it down on a note card than try to focus on that at the expense of the actual concepts. Another thing I'll mention here, the process of making the note card itself is very helpful to your learning, and that it's a way to help organize your thoughts. So it's possible there'll be some amount of note cards on exams later in the semester, probably not every exam, but it's something that I wanted to give for you as an option, at least on this first exam. For this exam, we have basically 3 modules, Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. They're fairly evenly distributed in terms of the content. Chapter 1 is probably the least focused in terms of the exam content, but you do need to know basically all 3 of those chapters, and it's evenly distributed throughout them. One other thing I will mention in terms of preparing, there is a lot of material in these chapters, and it might not always be obvious which material is important to memorize. I shouldn't say memorize. Important to know versus sort of random facts that you might happen to memorize along the way. And so the way I try to point you in the right direction here is the worksheets and quizzes. The worksheets and quizzes are what you want to make sure you know how to do. So I would say 95% of the exam is going to strongly resemble something you have seen before. Now that doesn't mean it is the exact same question, but it will be over a similar concept, probably asked in a similar way. So you won't have the same numbers, you won't have the same chemical equations, or the same formulas in every case, but it will be a similar layout, similar process to what you've seen on the worksheets. And things that didn't show up there are less likely to be on the exam. Also, the homework is sort of a guide as well. The caution I would put on there is that some of the homework questions will be more challenging than what you will see on the exam, and that's great in terms of preparing for it. But if you take that as this is the bar I need to clear, it's probably not quite as high as some of the more challenging homework questions. So that's 95% of the exam. So there's about 5% that could be something that came up in the textbook or the videos that was not emphasized on the worksheets or quizzes. So if all you do is, so if you haven't watched any of the videos, if you haven't mastered everything in the textbook, and all you've done is you've done all of the worksheets, and you feel confident about those, and you've done well on the quizzes, then you're probably going to do fairly well on the exam overall, and there'll just be a small amount of the content that is in addition to the other stuff. There will also be some practice exams that could be helpful in preparing for the exam. I want to mention that you should be doing the other stuff I mentioned before the practice exam. We'll come back and talk about kind of the best way to go about preparing here shortly. But there are a few things I want to point out here related to the practice exams. So the practice exams are exams that have been used in previous semesters of this course. However, there are a few differences, so I want to make sure those are clear before you start on them and have a kind of a different expectation. In the past, I have used some multiple choice questions fairly often on my exams. However, that is something that I basically stopped doing during the pandemic and haven't started doing. We found that they were not great with an online learning environment, and also that there's a lot that goes into a multiple choice test beyond just the content matter. So we're trying to get away from relying on multiple choice exams too much now. So you will not see that kind of multiple choice question. However, some of the content that was covered in a multiple choice question might show up in another format on the exam. The other questions you'll see there will have kind of a similar structure to what you might expect on your exam. The formatting will be similar, things of that nature. One thing I think I've experienced myself when I've taken exams is once you kind of learn the format, it's sort of like it's more comfortable, more familiar to you. So seeing something with the format that I've used in the past prior to you taking the exam could be beneficial. And then finally, some of the content was covered in a little bit of a different order with the textbook that we have previously used. I actually prefer the order of your textbook, which is one of the reasons why I transitioned to that one. So what you'll see is that what was the first exam on the previous course contains a little bit of content that we have not covered, but there is a little bit of content that we did cover that was not on the first exam. So you just basically want to look for on that second exam what of that content is a thing that we did cover, and on the first exam what did we not cover. So if you see something that looks completely unlike what we've talked about, then ignore that for now, and then the questions that you ignore now will be important on the second exam. So most of the second practice exam on there is nothing that would be relevant other than just a few questions related to concentration. And so the best way to use the practice exam is to treat it like an exam. So what that means is that you close your notes, except for your note card, and you set aside 90 minutes of time, and you just take the exam as if you were taking, a regular exam, and then you see how you feel about it. While you're doing that, there will probably be some areas you feel that you really confident about, you know how to do that, and there might be some areas that you feel less confident about, that you don't know how to do that. So go back then and focus on the areas where you may have struggled. I would say that taking into account, of course, that we are leaving out some areas and adding some areas, the relative proportion will be somewhat similar on here to what you'll be seeing. So you can kind of get a sense for how much of the material you have mastered. So treat it like an exam, and then you'll get a sense of whether or not you know it. If you're going through your notes as you take it, then you're not really getting that feel. So you want to kind of go through and feel, oh, there's this missing part that I need to go back and focus on before taking the actual exam. Okay, so kind of in summary, what I would recommend in terms of preparing for this exam, if there are any of the worksheets that you have not yet completed, go back and do all of those. And I would include there the first 3 pages of the MOLS worksheet. So the first 3 pages are content on this first exam. The remainder will be content on the next exam. Again, I'm not collecting that until the whole thing is done. But if you haven't got through those pages yet, I'd recommend doing so. And then complete the homework if you would like to improve your quiz scores, or if you need more practice. So some of this you might come back to later, but it's definitely any quiz that you feel like the grade you got was not the grade you want, go and do the homework for that one. And then anything that you feel like, I wish I was better at this, the homework is a good place to focus. Make a note card. So whatever information you think you will need to have access to when you take the exam, make sure you have it on the note card. Of course, you'll be given a periodic table. But other than that, you need to write down what you think you need. Once you have your note card, then go ahead and do the practice exam using only your note card as a reference. And once you've done that, then you can refine your study and say, okay, well, maybe this area I did well at, so I'm fine there, but this other area, I feel like I need a little bit more help, a little bit more mastery of that. So maybe go back and do some of the homework that's related to that area. Final piece of advice here. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most important piece of advice, but probably the most underappreciated piece of advice is to get a good night's sleep. Now, you don't have to do this every night, but at least do it the night before the exam. Okay, so we do have a morning class, and if your brain has gotten rest, it will work better. If you have eaten breakfast, it will work better. So even if you don't eat breakfast every day or get a good night's sleep every night, make an exception for the day before the exam. And I think if you do, you will do a lot better than you expect. So that is my advice for preparing for the first exam. Please feel free to comment on the discussion board with any questions you have about it.